Heaven sent.
It's time to take things back to the magical year of 2006. The seventh generation of consoles were in full swing, the evolution of gaming was at an all-time peak, and the Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3 were further waging the almost decade-long battle of the console wars. Things were looking incredible for the future of gaming, but for much greater reason than anything Sony or Microsoft had to offer. As most of you are likely to remember, the Nintendo Wii was actually the highest-selling console of this time, and for good reason. Releasing on November 19, 2006, the Wii was an incredible force in showcasing the capability of 7th gen hardware, bringing motion controls to a whole new level and delivering an almost arcade-like experience to a home setting. Initially being developed under the codename Revolution, the console's lead designer, Shigeru Miyamoto, had planned to do just that, to revolutionize the experience of console gaming and immerse players in a way that had never been seen before. With the Wii surpassing both the PS3 and Xbox 360 in individual sales, it was obvious that both Microsoft and Sony were looking for a way to compete with its success, and their answers came in the form of the Xbox Kinect and PlayStation Move. Both were along the same lines as the Wii, making use of motion controls and involving the player in a much more physical fashion, but both had greatly fallen short on promise, execution, and of course, sales, leading to the Wii being recognized as the true victor. But what if I told you that the Wii wasn't the first of its kind, and that just 2 years earlier, there was another system developed with the very same concept in mind? You'd probably say that I'm crazy, but you'll be shocked to find that it was a very real thing. And so with that, my friends, I think it's time that we indulge ourselves into the obscure and ambiguous world of the Zavix, as we come to find just what it was all about. So let's get moving. The history of the Zavix is an incredibly foggy road, with little to no information on its development or even its existence. But from what I could dig up in my research, we're gonna have to go back to the year of 1995, starting with a former employee of Nintendo and his ambition for innovation. That employee being Katsuya Nakagawa. Katsuya was a longtime developer for Nintendo, having worked with them for over 15 years. But around the mid-90s, he noticed a decline in the company, as well as their lack of adjustment to the new generation of gaming. Their stock at an all-time low and their plans to continue making cartridge-based consoles in a world now ran by CD-ROM, he felt that it was time to leave the nest and pursue something much more revolutionary. He reached out to 8 of his former colleagues, all of which had their share of work on many past consoles such as the Famicom, and together, they created the SSD Company Limited. SSD, standing for Shinseidai or New Generation, was created with hopes of creating technology that could better the world in new and exciting ways. With their aim being cast on innovation, they wanted to focus their attention to motion-controlled gaming. Now back at this time, motion-controlled gaming was pretty much unheard of at this point. I mean, you had arcade games that would essentially reenact the basis of motion controls, but to actually gauge gameplay throughout your physical movements in front of a screen, now that was rare. So SSD was looking to change that. They started by creating a slew of motion-based games for licensed IPs, with their first big hit being in 2003 with Kenshin Dragon Quest. This game was an all-in-one plug-and-play console, in which the player used the sword in place of a controller and would physically have to wield it to play the game. The game's ROM was located on a little plastic shield that was also used as a memory card slot for saving your playthroughs. The included sword controller was used to both walk, shield, and attack enemies, with motion controls being used to detect the direction of your attacks. The story, taking place in the same world as the first Dragon Quest game, would lead players on a journey that spanned 8 chapters, with multiple different minigames. The game was well received, and had accumulated over 300,000 pre-orders before its release, even being gifted with a special award at the 2004 CESA Game Awards. And looking back, when have you ever seen a plug-and-play game do this well? The game's success led to its technology being used by Tiger Electronics for their own roster of licensed plug-and-play games, The Lord of the Rings Warrior of Middle-earth being one that you may remember. But to find this level of success that Kenshin found as a plug-and-play game, now that was pretty impressive. This newfound success was incredible for SSD, and gave them the confidence they needed to progress forward into new ideas for the future. They began kicking the tires with an idea to create a motion-controlled console, which would have a primary focus on sports and fitness. Rather than competing with the current generation of consoles at that time, they were aiming to create something fresh, combining both exercise and gaming into one, giving the players more immersion as well as promoting fitness. Now this was a bold concept, as the 6th generation of gaming was in full swing at this time, but they believed it was an idea that could change the world, and even put a whole new spin on the way we viewed gaming. They got to work on their new console, and decided to officially showcase it for the very first time at the 2004 Las Vegas Consumer Electronics Show. The name of the product was found to be revealed as the Zavix port, better known as just Zavix, with the AVI in between two X's standing for Audio Video Interactive. The Zavix had an interesting spec makeup, with the CPU being embedded in the cartridge of its games, rather than the console itself. The console was set for release on August of 2004, and was planned to have 3 separate games to choose from: baseball, bowling, and tennis. All of these games were given a $49.99 price tag, and included their very own peripherals required to play the games. For instance, the baseball game included its very own motion control bat controller, while tennis had its own tennis racket, with motion controls being implemented for each game with the aim of giving its players a more involved experience. Just a little over 5 months after the console's release, SSD had announced their partnership with the legendary stuntman Jackie Chan, and were planning to license 2 of his very own titles for the system, one being Jackie Chan Powerboxing, and the other being called the J-Mat. Now I know what you're thinking. With all of these games and peripherals being released in the mid-2004 to early 2005, almost 2 years before the release of the Nintendo Wii, doesn't a lot of this stuff look familiar? Well, it definitely does, and to be honest, the resemblance is almost uncanny, which really begs the question, did Nintendo perhaps maybe borrow these ideas? Well, that's up for speculation, but in terms of success and execution, the Zavix was nowhere near as profitable or functional as its later competitor. You see, while the company may have had the consumer's best interest in mind by making their primary focus on combining fitness with gaming, it just wasn't wrapped up in a pretty enough package to be profitable. While the Zavix was the only console of its kind, many other like-minded ideas were being flooded into the market at this time, with products such as the iToy and even DancePad gaming beginning to take over in the realm of home consoles. These products were taking advantage of the capabilities of much more powerful consoles such as the PS2 or Xbox, all the while still physically involving its players. The Zavix may have had a great idea with sport-shaped peripherals and motion controls, but the execution was lackluster to say the least. Starting with the graphics capability of the Zavix port, most of the games released were comparable to NES-style graphics, later progressing to a more PS1 style at best. Now, it's not to say that those systems didn't have great visuals in their own right, it's more so that the visual style of the Zavix was incredibly outdated at that time. With many of the system's games having little to offer in visual product, it was hard to compete with much more advanced games being released at that time on more modern consoles. And second, with the gameplay relying heavily on the emphasis of motion control, it was well documented that the peripherals were not quite as responsive as players may have hoped for. Perusing many different articles and reviews found on YouTube of the Zavix, I came to find that most people had a pretty similar verdict of the functionality of it. I mean, yeah, it would kinda work, but as far as accuracy and immersion went, it wasn't quite on the money. I mean, with the console's aim being so highly focused on fitness and getting their players up and moving, this doesn't look all too intensive, does it? Now, I'm not here to completely rip this console to shreds, as it was obviously an ambitious and innovative feat that SSD had achieved for its time, but it only goes to show why you've probably never heard of it. It was a next level idea executed with outdated specs, and just looking at the console itself from a physical standpoint, which would you rather have? The console wasn't selling too well, and SSD had decided to allocate a good bit of their reach into healthcare at that time. They had came up with 2 separate projects in which they were looking to provide patients seeking physical therapy with their own Zavix port consoles to encourage more physical activity, as well as consoles being used for training of the prefrontal cortex with a program called the Brain Club. 5 cartridges were released for these exercises and would collect data of the patient's progress throughout their playthrough. These efforts were a beautiful thing, and when you look at the ambition behind SSD and their passion for bettering those who use their products, it really was admirable. But in the cutthroat industry that is the video game business, good deeds don't mean a thing if they aren't turning a profit. Businesses gotta make money, and for SSD, things weren't looking so great. Their worst nightmare was just on the horizon. and the fate of SSD and its innovative console were about to meet their match. On November 19, 2006, the Nintendo Wii was released worldwide, with over 600,000 units being sold within its very first week. Making matters worse, remember how the Zavix was known for its bowling, baseball, and tennis games? Yeah, that's exactly what the Wii decided to release for their console as well. And just guess who did it better? Yeah, no contest there. This was essentially the beginning of the end for the Zavix, with their last game being produced in 2008. Over the console's lifespan, there were 10 games released in North America and 15 released in Japan. And this was all in a span of about 4 years. So as you can imagine, the Wii was just stepping all over those pitiful numbers, and there was no shot of Zavix being able to compete with the technological prowess of Nintendo's latest powerhouse. SSD had continued to shift their focus on promoting their products to rehabilitation facilities, but really to no avail. By 2012, the company had ceased development of all Zavix products and began liquidating their assets in 2013. A lot of the promotion for this liquidation can still be found on the company's Facebook, which made its last post on August 16, 2013. And just as the Zavix had inconspicuously released years prior, it had now went out in an equally obscure fashion. It came and went with almost no one noticing, and if it weren't for me finding this random advertisement for it recently, I would have never even thought to have given it a look myself. I still find it so interesting that this company had essentially created the Wii before the Wii was even a thing, and seem to have been the pioneers in motion-controlled gaming from what I can find. All I know is that I admire their hard work and ambition to create something different, as well as always keeping the health of their consumers in mind with their products. Maybe with a little more overhead and some better technology, the Zavix could have left the world of gaming with a much bigger impression, but unfortunately, it just didn't go like that.